The epistle reading expresses faith in Jesus Christ, acknowledging the suffering that may be linked with expressing that faith, and offers the assurance of Christ's support. It ends with a challenge, as we have learned to expect from Paul, and the saying that is quoted may very well have been part of an early Christian hymn. While there is little debate about who wrote the letters to Timothy, the tone follows Paul in some respect. If Paul had written them, this would have been during his second imprisonment. Listen closely, as if in Timothy's shoes, to 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 8 through 15, found on page 212 of the Pew Bibles. Remember Jesus Christ, raised from the dead, a descendant of David. That is my gospel, for which I suffered hardship, even to the point of being chained like a criminal. But the word of God is not chained. Therefore I endure everything for the sake of the elect, so that they may also obtain the salvation that is in Jesus Christ with eternal glory. The saying is sure, if we have died with him, we will also live with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. If we deny him, he will also deny us. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. Remind them of this and warn them before God that they are to avoid wrangling over words, which does no good but only ruins those who are listening. Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved by him, a worker who has no need to be ashamed, rightly explaining the word of truth.
And our focus lesson comes to us from the Gospel of Luke, the 17th chapter, verses 11 through 19, and can be found on page 80 of your Pew Bibles. This gospel reading that we hear is of 10 lepers who call to Jesus from the prescribed distance that was part of the protection for society in those days. They were between Samaria and Galilee, which border on each other. And the lepers are all healed, but it seems that their healing is not necessarily instantaneous, but gradual as they go to see the priest to be officially proclaimed clean. And we are not told who they are, except that one is a Samaritan, and he is the only one, to disobey Jesus' instructions and rush back to say thank you. Jews and Samaritans both felt that they had a monopoly on the worship of the Lord, and that excluded the other and regarded each other as heretics. And we can see that Jesus' healing is a demonstration that God's love is not limited to our human prejudice. If we wish, we can see the Samaritan's approach and response in that very same way. So let us listen closely for the good news for us today in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 17, beginning with the 11th verse. On the way to Jerusalem, he was passing along between Samaria and Galilee, and as he entered a village, he was met by 10 lepers who stood at a distance and lifted up their voices and said, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." And when he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were cleansed. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. And he fell on his face at Jesus' feet, giving him thanks. Now he was a Samaritan. And then said Jesus, "Were not 10 cleansed? Where are the 9? Was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" And he said to him, "Rise and go your way. Your faith has made you well." The word of the Lord. We give praise and thanks. Amen. One day, the boss called one of his young employees into his office. And he said, "Robert, you've been with us for about a year now. You started off in the mailroom, and a week later you were promoted into a sales position. A month later after that, you were promoted to district manager of the sales department. And just 4 months after that, you were promoted to vice chairman. Now it's time for me to retire, and I want you to take over the company. What do you have to say to that?" "Thanks," said the employee. "Thanks," the boss said. "Thanks? Is that all you have to say is thanks?" Robert said, "Oh, all right. Thanks, Dad." I love the theologian Robert Fulghum. He said, he wrote the book, "All the things I learned in kindergarten is all I need," or something to that effect. And of those things that he learned in kindergarten was to say please and thank you, as Robin had shared with our young Christians this morning. And our young man knew that lesson. He thanked his dad. And the Samaritan knew his lesson and thanked Jesus. Now, in the past, and I've done this about 8 times, I have asked for volunteers from the congregation to come forward. Now, no, don't worry, I'm not going to do that this time. I think last week all my questions were a little bit over the top. So I'll give you a break today. But I want to share it with you because what I did, in previous congregations, I would ask 9 people to come forward and ask them that each one would be one of the 9 lepers that did not give thanks. And they were to explain why they didn't give thanks. So over the years, I have heard anywhere from about 63 to 72 excuses. And so I share with you today some of the better excuses that I've heard over these years. And it sheds a little different light on what is occurring here. Leper 1 had been a school teacher. Now wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. You know leprosy, don't you? I mean, how many of you have had leprosy? Oh, no? I guess leprosy is perhaps one of those diseases that has been eradicated, at least in the majority of the world. I know that down in Louisiana at one point in our history, there was a leper colony, and in Hawaii there was a leper colony. I think I'd rather be in Hawaii than in Louisiana. But leprosy itself was a very dreaded disease. It would be where the body would literally rot. Fingers, by the joints would fall off. Toes would fall off. Noses would decay and fall off. Ears would fall off. Basically, the human body would begin disintegrating gradually over time. And you can only imagine, really imagine the decay, the smell, the bacteria, the filth that would come with this disease. And it really isn't a surprise that in the ancient days the community would ostracize those that had that disease because they didn't understand it, they didn't have ways of healing it. And they were afraid that it would be contagious. And so if you were living at home and suddenly you came down with this skin disorder, you were kicked out of home, and then the community would kick you out of town, and your only opportunity for survival would be to find others, and it had to be others like you, hence leper colonies, to live in caves or tombs or that are abandoned or just some place of shelter. And imagine that you're with these group of people and all you see reflected back to you is the decay and the disintegration that's occurring within yourself. It isn't a very appetizing or even slightly positive reflection to have. Think of the depression the anguish that came. And to have to rely on begging, but begging from a distance, they would have to be at least 50 feet from an individual, and they would have to be yelling, "Unclean, unclean, stay away." And yet, do you have any food? And if they had food, they would have to leave it. And then you'd walk over and pick up whatever was left, if you could get to it quick enough before the dogs or other things grabbed it. It was a life of living beyond just hand to mouth. It isn't any wonder that the death rate, the fatality, was so high with that. Eventually, the scientists came up with a cure, and then they came up with a couple other cures that were more effective, and hence we can live pretty much leprosy-free these days. But leprosy was a death sentence, and a dreaded death sentence because of all the repercussions that were involved in that. So, leper 1 was a high school teacher, or a school teacher. And his explanation was that as he realized that he was being healed, he was suddenly so excited because his life had been so dedicated to educating children that he couldn't wait to get back to his community to be among the young people, that he could start teaching them. And when he got to the town, he gathered the community together and they praised God for the miracle that had happened to him at that time. He didn't give thanks to Jesus, but he did give thanks to God. Leper 2 was a stay-at-home mom. And as she developed this disease, her husband had to force her out of the house, and the community forced her out of town. So she was separated from her loved ones, her children and her husband, her family. And so as she was walking back, she realized that she was being healed. And she was overjoyed with the fact that she could go home and be with her loving family once again. And so she rushed home. And it just happened to be that her son was one of the children that was at the school that the teacher was at. And he came home excited about the news that he had heard and saw his mother standing there. And they wept in joy and praised God for the miracle that occurred. You kind of get where these excuses are coming up. They're not the typical sense that these 9 individuals were ungrateful in what they did, in the healing that they received, but rather that they were so overwhelmed with the excitement of having been healed that they immediately rushed to whatever it was that their passion was, and embraced it and shared that news with all those around them so that they could celebrate the wonderful miracle that Christ had given them. And so I propose that in a more positive outlook, that each one of the 10 were thankful each in their own way. And it was just the Samaritan who was the outcast, that was the foreigner, that was in this in-between place. It says that Jesus was on the border between Samaria and Galilee. I mean, how many times is Jesus traveling the edges, the outlying area? One could say that Jesus may even be thinking and living outside of the box. And the Samaritan then comes to him as a foreigner, overwhelmed with gratitude, because he knows that Jesus is a Jew, that Jesus should, by all social rules, look upon him as an enemy, as a heretic, as an outcast, besides the fact that he had leprosy, just the fact that he was a Samaritan. And so he returns to Jesus in gratitude for that double acceptance, that double grace that he has received. Now, this is supposed to be a stewardship sermon. And what I believe is occurring here in this healing story is that the gratefulness, the thankfulness, is a tithe to Jesus. You know a tithe? I don't think we practice tithing in UCC. Tithing is where you give 10% of your income. There are churches, denominations, even synagogues, that when you join their church, their synagogue, they ask, how much do you make? And we will tell you how much you have to contribute to the church. And we don't care if you put it in the offering plate or you send it through PayPal or just drop it off in the church office. But, this is the prescribed amount that you have to pay. That was tithing. And tithing still goes on today in some places. And in the studies of the UCC and the offerings that we give, what the statistics show is that each member of the church gives roughly 2 to 3% of their income. And that when we ask in a stewardship campaign to contribute to the church, we ask, increase that amount by 0.5%, 1%. If you're really thankful and generous, 2%. Just bump it up a little bit to show your gratitude for what the church is doing in our community. Now, someone told me I excluded our viewers out there on TV land, and I'm not a TV evangelist, but you have the address of the church at the end of every broadcast, and you can easily jot that down and send in a contribution. I mean, we pay for the privilege of sending this worship service out to the community. That some people probably think that it's a service that Blue Ridge offers freely, but they don't. And so any contributions would be helpful in that light. But the lesson for us today in the lepers is the fact that the lepers tithed their gratitude to Jesus. 1/10, 1 out of 10, came back to offer thanks to him. And that was all that was prescribed by law. Now, is that how we are to act in what is prescribed by law? I would hope not. That we would offer our thanks through generosity of giving. But that goes beyond just dollars and cents, because also you can give in so many different ways. And I'm kind of moving away from the stewardship theme now. But there are ways in which we can offer our gratitude in thinking outside the box. And I offer an example of that, in which there was a famous plastic surgeon. I'm told this is a true story. Dr. Maxwell Maltz. Back in the 60s and 70s, he wrote a book about psycho-cybernetics that tells about how you can turn your life around. It was maybe one of the first self-help books that was out. But he was a plastic surgeon. And one day a woman came to see him about her husband. And she told him that her husband had been injured in a home fire. That their home had caught on fire, that her parents, his in-laws, were living in the house. And they got out of the house, she and her husband. But the wife's parents were still in the house, and he went back into the flames to save his in-laws, his mother-in-law and his father-in-law. He was overcome by the flames, and as a result was badly burned and did not save her parents, that they died in the flames. And she went on to tell him that, he has a terrible, terrible sense of guilt, that he feels he failed in not saving his in-laws, and that God punished him in this failure for disfiguring him, for burning him, that was his punishment. And that he had withdrawn from all activities within the community. He had withdrawn from all activities with the family. She said, he has even withdrawn from me. And I want my husband back. And the surgeon, Dr. Maltz, said, well, I certainly can do plastic surgery on him. And she said, no, he will never accept that. He will never accept that. What I want you to do is disfigure my face so that he can see me and know that I want to feel his pain. I want to share in the pain that he endures day after day after day because I love him so much and want our relationship restored. Well, the surgeon, Dr. Maltz, said, I can't do that. And so he went to the home, and the husband was locked in his bedroom. And Dr. Maltz knocked on the door and got no response. He knocked on the door louder. Again, no response. He tried the doorknob, and it was securely locked. And he said, I am the surgeon who is here to talk with you that I can restore your good looks. And there was no response. Finally, Dr. Maltz said, I want to tell you what your wife has done. And he proceeded to tell her husband through the door that she had come wanting herself to be disfigured for him so that she could draw closer to him in that experience and restore their relationship. And he heard some footsteps shuffle towards the door, and slowly it cracked open. And he said, I'll let you do the surgery. The relationship was restored in healing wholeness. That's simply what Jesus, God, the Spirit, wants for each and every one of us. And for those of us that are feeling more adequately secure and whole, we are to be the bearers of that healing wholeness to share. And through the open doors of this church, out into the community, out into the world, we are enabled by God, Christ, and the Spirit to enact and fulfill that purpose. With doors locked and lights off, we cannot. Amen.